Hey guys, welcome to the WTF True Crime and Real Life Story channel, where I talk about all of the most frightening, strange and unbelievable stories from around the world, including discussing stories such as this one. Now this one is nasty and deceiving. Find out what happened, as it will make you think twice of exactly who you can and you can't trust. That much is for sure. The event of this case and true story is behind the 2011 movie Bernie, but I will tell you that the real events are more astounding than anything that Hollywood could have dreamt up. You will see. Bernie Tide was a respected and beloved funeral director in Carthage, Texas. He was known to be friendly, well-liked, considerate and helpful, and he always took great pride in his work. He was always a consoling shoulder for the bereaved throughout the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and especially towards the elderly. Nevertheless, when Tide became the constant companion of the meanest woman in Carthage, Marjorie Nugent, who was 40 years his senior, 40 years, it came as a surprise and a shock to many who knew them. However, despite the strange relationship and the locals' bewilderment, Tide and Nugent became inseparable, and it was believed they may have even shared a romantic relationship. However, things took a nasty turn when Nugent was then found dead in a freezer in 1997, and Tide immediately came under suspicion. The town had trouble believing that their favourite son had committed such a heinous crime and an unspeakable act of sheer brutality. No, not Bernie Tide, they said. He was loved by everyone. Bernie Tide was born on the 2nd of August 1958 in Abilene, Texas, and when he was just 3 years old, his mother died in a car accident, and whilst his father escaped unscathed and unharmed as the driver of the vehicle, his father never forgave himself and then began to drink heavily and into a stupor, and then he subsequently died when Tide was only 15 years old. This hit Tide hard, and then soon after leaving high school, he started working in a funeral home and began to show a particular talent for makeup and hair. Then in 1985, the 27-year-old Tide moved to Carthage, which had a population of just 6,500 people. And then, as an assistant funeral director at Hawthorne Funeral Homes, Tide soon became a beloved pillar of the Carthage community. And despite being an assistant funeral director, he wore colourful Tommy Hilfiger clothes when not wearing his sombre funeral suits, and he drove around town in his Lincoln Continental whilst being friendly with everyone. He also became a preacher and featured soloist in the choir at the First United Methodist Church, and worked with the music and the theatre departments of his local college, where he would often take on starring roles himself. Then, within his job, he would comfort families of the deceased at funerals, staying close to the grieving widows and holding their hands to steady them. Tide visited them for days and weeks after the funeral, making sure they were all right, and all in all, he was widely regarded as the nicest man in town. Then around this time he met Marjorie Nugent, who was a long-standing member of the richest family in Carthage, after her husband had made his fortune as an oilman. However, to say that Nugent was not well liked was a gross understatement, as many believed her to be the meanest woman in Carthage, lording her wealth and status over the town arrogantly and with not much respect for others. On top of this, Nugent hadn't seen her only son in years, or her grandchildren, who had sued her over trust money, and so she was just not popular with anyone, it seemed. Tide met Nugent at her husband's funeral in 1990, and Tide even sang a hymn and escorted Nugent to and from her husband's grave, offering her his coat in the chilly cemetery. Then a few days later, Tide checked in on her at her house. It just seemed like she didn't have any friends, he said, and I just felt this compelling desire to give her some friendship, he said. Then the warm and affable Tide invited her shopping and to dinner, and they took longer trips together to Dallas, New York and elsewhere along the East Coast, and before long it seemed they were going everywhere together. Tide and Nugent visited several countries together, cruising the Nile and the Rhine, and despite town gossip, the pair had maintained that there was nothing sexual about the relationship, as Tide said that he thought of Nugent as more as a mother figure and a friend, and that was how Bernie convinced so many people of what was appearing more and more strange as they acted like a couple in one another's company. In 1993, Nugent convinced Tide to work for her full-time as her business manager, and thus she gave him access to her financial accounts so he could pay her bills, and she even went one step further as she rewrote her will, making Tide her sole beneficiary. It seemed that she wanted him to spend money on himself, and Nugent maintained that no inheritance reached her family, not one thin dime, she would say. As years passed though, Nugent then started to become more and more possessive and was expecting 24-hour obedience, and she would page Tide constantly as they were living in separate homes. Tide still had to attend Nugent's house multiple times a day, and as time went on, and trapped as Nugent's full-time caregiver, Tide couldn't muster the courage to leave. He felt he was obliged to be at her beck and call. She was just so controlling, he said. She felt like she could own me, and I guess to some degree she did. Tide had even said at one point he had actually imagined just hitting her over the head with a baseball bat to stop her for good, but then said that he couldn't bear the thought of her suffering. Finally, and one day, however, he steeled himself to get rid of her for good, as his urges had taken over. On the 19th of November 1996, Tide, when in the company of Nugent, then shot her once in the back with her .22 caliber rifle as she stopped to pet her dog in her garage, and then shot her 3 more times. He had gone through with his shocking and murderous plan. He had killed her in cold blood, and for what? Tide then wrapped Nugent snugly in a sheet and placed her into the bottom of a chest freezer, covering her in food items, and in a twisted set of events afterwards, Tide even attended a college musical rehearsal that same day. It was only when witnesses later said that Tide then started becoming unprecedentedly generous over the weeks, despite reportedly seeming like regular old Bernie at other times, that people started becoming suspicious and they knew that something was up. Spreading an estimated £2 million of Nugent's money around town whilst pretending that she was still alive, Tide invested in a Western wear shop, pledged money to a church for a new wing, and bought cars for at least 10 people. If anyone asked, Tide always said they just missed Nugent, or that she was taking a nap, or she just popped out. However, after around 9 months had passed, and when Tide had said that Nugent was in Ohio visiting her sister or in the hospital recuperating from a stroke that left her speechless, is when Nugent's son eventually grew suspicious, and he and his daughter accompanied police to Nugent's house on the 18th of August 1997, and they found her neatly wrapped in the freezer where she was frozen solid. Nugent was transported to the coroner's office in Dallas on the back of a truck hooked up to a generator, and almost immediately Tide admitted to murdering Nugent. But bizarrely, the locals in Carthage still didn't seem to hold it against him. After all, he was their lovable Bernie. This in turn made sure that Bernie Tide's trial was moved 60 miles away because of the overwhelming support for him in Carthage. And then, in Tide's trial, which lasted less than a week, he was found guilty and given a life sentence. Then in 2014, defence lawyer Jody Cole, who was inspired by the 2011 film about his case, Bernie, discovered new evidence. Amongst items taken from Tide's house after his original arrest were 4 books on childhood sexual abuse. Tide reluctantly admitted to Cole that he had endured molestation by an uncle from the age of 12, with psychiatrists saying he experienced a dissociative episode during the time when he killed Nugent. Tide was then released pending a resentencing hearing and lived in the garage apartment of a film director, Richard Linklater, as a condition of his release. Then, on the 22nd of April 2016, following Tide's resentencing trial, the jury imposed a new sentence of 99 years or life for Tide, and he's presently incarcerated in Huntsville, Texas, and not eligible for parole until the 3rd of August 2029, the day after his 71st birthday. Now, as the years have gone by, opinions in Carthage have changed, and most locals now favour Tide serving his full sentence. This was a story of greed, power, temptation and mistrust, and it's the old saying, you just can't trust anyone. So be careful out there, my fellow comrades. Stay safe, stay blessed, stay healthy and happy, and I will see you for the next story. Cheers.